The Denver Broncos held their pre-draft press conference today with the NFL draft being just 1 week away. And they may have tipped their hand a little bit as to what direction they're going to go in the first round. Are they going to take a quarterback or not? And also, we had some breaking news drop today that may force the Denver Broncos' hand a little bit if they do indeed want to land their quarterback of the future out of the top four guys in the 2024 draft. So let's jump right into what the Denver Broncos let out to the public today in the press conference with George Payton and Sean Payton. And as you would imagine, the first question that was going to be asked by the local media is, what are they going to do in the first round? Are they going to take a quarterback? And Sean Payton responded to Mike Kliss's question, which was very blunt and straightforward. Are you going to take a quarterback in the first round? Do you feel like you have to? With a pretty blunt and straightforward answer. Do we have to draft a quarterback? You'd say it sure looks like we have to draft a quarterback, but he also said that the Broncos have to make sure it's the right one, and George Payton added that you cannot force it. It feels like there's a little bit of PTSD there from the Russell Wilson trade. Sean Payton, or George Payton, I should say, forced the Russell Wilson trade, and it came back to bite him big time, so he doesn't want to be as aggressive as it feels like Sean Payton may want to be. George Payton let off the vibe that he may feel a little bit more comfortable not being as aggressive for a quarterback this year and maybe landing one of the top position players, tackle, edge, corner possibly, somebody like that, maybe even a wide receiver. But I do think Sean Payton has made it pretty clear that he does want to get a quarterback. He feels like the team needs to get a quarterback, but it may not be right away when the Broncos want to get their guy, because there is a little bit of news that came out today on the Orange and Blue Today podcast hosted by Andrew Mason and my guy Cecil Lammy of 104.3 The Fan. Cecil talked to representatives from 3 teams. I'm not exactly sure who those people are, what standing they hold in the organization, but he talked to people who are affiliated with 3 different teams in the NFL. And it's pretty clear that the New York Giants are bluffing about wanting to take a quarterback with the 6th overall pick. And it felt like that was always the direction they were going to go. They stood by Daniel Jones most of this offseason, at least in the public eye in the press conferences. And then they signed Drew Lock, who's a perfectly capable backup and insurance policy in the event that Jones isn't healthy or underperforms. And they still, of course, have Tommy Cutlets DeVito on the roster as well. So that makes some sense. However, the New England Patriots are not bluffing. They are going to take a quarterback with the 3rd overall pick, according to Cecil Lammy. And indications are that quarterback is going to be Drake May. It is one of the worst kept secrets for the past couple of weeks. For the past couple of weeks now, it's been one of the worst kept secrets. Sorry, I can't get English out today. That Jaden Daniels is going to be drafted number 2 overall to the Washington Commanders. That has been set in stone for a while. The Commanders did interview a bunch of quarterback prospects at one time, kind of to stir the pot in the media a little bit, but reports coming out of Washington and reports coming out of pretty much the entire NFL landscape and looking at the betting odds will indicate that Jaden Daniels is going to be drafted number 2 overall to the Washington Commanders. That leaves Drake May number 3 overall to the New England Patriots. What's going to happen with J.J. McCarthy after that? The Broncos might have to trade up and outbid the Minnesota Vikings, who have a ton of draft capital, if they want to land J.J. McCarthy. So that poses a couple of questions. Do the Broncos feel like J.J. McCarthy is a difference maker in this year's draft? Do they feel like he's the guy that could get them over that hump? And do they feel like they can give up the necessary draft capital? And that might include Pat Surtain. George Payton does not want to trade Pat Surtain. That's very, very clear. Benjamin Albright's very connected to the Broncos organization. He's a reporter for KOA. I think those connections are a little bit more on the George Payton side than on the Sean Payton side. The question becomes, is Sean Payton going to be willing to part ways with Pat Surtain? And will he be able to convince ownership to approve that trade? I think what Sean wants is what he's going to get, but it's also going to be within reason. Trading away the best player on the roster for the fourth quarterback in the NFL draft could be a tough sell, but I believe that if Sean Payton truly thinks that J.J. McCarthy is the difference maker, that he could mold and make the franchise quarterback of this team for the next 10 to 15 years plus, just like he had with Drew Brees, although obviously he didn't select Drew Brees in the draft, he inherited him as a free agent. But similar thought process here, if Sean Payton can get his guy for the next decade plus, then I really feel like he's going to do whatever it takes to get that guy, even if it means the roster may suffer for the next couple of years. He's got Jarrett Stidham, who he could have J.J. McCarthy sit behind, and J.J. McCarthy is young enough where sitting behind Stidham while they build the roster and then turning the operation over to him, that might be the most realistic option here. So that could be where the Denver Broncos head. Now, pivoting back to this press conference here, because that's obviously the meat and potatoes of this video, Sean Payton did confirm that there are 3 teams that you could definitely argue need a quarterback in the area where Denver picks, and that is the Broncos, the Vikings, and the Raiders. And those teams obviously all pick 11th with Minnesota, 12th with Denver, and then 13th with the Raiders. So it's going to be all about who wants to come up and who has the resources to come up. We know that Minnesota does. It's going to be all about if Denver wants to indeed part ways with Pat Surtain. And that's the big question and debate of this whole video. Me personally, the only way I am doing that is if Sean Payton is confident that J.J. McCarthy can be his guy moving forward. If Sean Payton's confident enough to make that move, then I trust Sean to make that move. He's got a good judgment for the quarterback position. So I believe in what Sean wants to do. If that's what he wants to do, then I endorse that move wholeheartedly. George Payton, again, being a little bit more conservative when it comes to the quarterback route, he left the option on the table for the Broncos to go a little bit deeper in the class and maybe select the 5th quarterback off the board, Bo Nix, 6th quarterback off the board, which would be Michael Penix, or maybe in the 7th quarterback off the board being somebody like a Spencer Rattler. The Broncos say that it's a good quarterback class according to George Payton. He was excited to get to know them over this pre-draft process, and he feels that there are 7 or 8 players that the Broncos really like. I don't know if George is playing politics here or if he genuinely feels that there's 7 guys who are going to be able to play in the NFL at a relatively high level in the future. I just don't know if there are that many guys. I do think that there is a big gap between the top 4 guys and Bo Nix, and an even bigger gap between Bo Nix and Michael Penix Jr., and then an even bigger gap between Michael Penix Jr. and guys like Spencer Rattler, Jordan Travis, Michael Pratt, those kind of flavor of quarterbacks. You could even argue there's gaps between those players individually, but I think that there's very clear better options for the Denver Broncos, and the top 4 quarterbacks right now, for me, Caleb Williams, Jaden Daniels, J.J. McCarthy, and Drake May. I have it in that order, but it seems that the NFL is a little bit higher on Drake May than J.J. McCarthy. We'll have to see what direction New England ultimately wants to go, but it feels like that direction for right now is Drake May. However, George Payton has also left the door open for the Denver Broncos to trade up and him endorse it. He said, if it's a player that you feel like can change the landscape of your franchise going forward, and he did mention the quarterback position specifically, he said that you do whatever you have to do to go up and get that player. So if the Denver Broncos do indeed feel like J.J. McCarthy is that franchise difference maker, then they're going to do whatever it takes to go up and get him. So, moving into the rest of the press conference, quarterback will definitely circle back to a little bit later on in the video, but Sean Payton then talked a little bit about the Denver Broncos pre-draft process and how they may actually be using AI to advance how they go about this whole process. So, Sean said, quote, "The business we're in, we have all the tape. Then you're gathering all the information you can. measurements, interactions, learning, which is very important so you can make the best decision relative to how you grade the player. You're going to see in the next 5 to 10 years AI help in this process. Now, you have to provide what you think is important to that AI algorithm, but there are a lot of flights, a lot of miles traveled for a good reason in this process. The process is good, but AI could kind of help streamline that process and make it a little bit smoother as that technology develops over the next 5 to 10 years. So that's something that actually came up a couple of times today in the press conference, how AI could streamline the pre-draft evaluation. And I'm really curious how these teams are going to adopt it and which teams are going to be a little bit more forward-thinking with using AI in their pre-draft evaluations. And it seems like the Denver Broncos and Sean Payton, despite him being labeled as an old school minded coach, is a little bit willing to try new things here and use AI in talent evaluation, which I again do endorse. I think that is one way that AI could really help out in the football industry. They were then asked how the league values certain positions in the NFL and if they would take a player who's higher on their draft board because they feel like that player is a premium position in the NFL. And Sean made it clear that historically speaking, the league has always valued quarterback, tackle, edge, corner, and nowadays he didn't specifically mention this position, but I would also throw wide receiver into that position. I think that those are the premium positions where you may have a guy a little bit higher on your draft board just because they play that position, because those are the positions that are the hardest to fill in the NFL. So I think that the Denver Broncos definitely are going to factor in if their quarterback is there and it's, say, their quarterback 3 on the board, but they pass on him over their, say, top-rated offensive tackle on the board because they know the quarterback could be the biggest difference maker long-term. That's the kind of balance that you have to find when you're evaluating these players and ultimately making the decision as to who you want to draft. And George Payton said that you don't want to reach for a player just because they have a position pedigree like quarterback, edge, corner, so on and so forth. You can never be 100%, he said, but you try to project it and you play the odds as much as you can. You look at previous years as to how these positions fell and what positions ultimately ended up being the biggest difference makers for your team. So I think that that's all going to factor in, and if the Broncos do feel like the quarterback is going to be the top position difference-making position, or if it's edge, tackle, corner, wide receiver, they're going to take that position because if somebody who's the top position falls to them, then they could very well be willing to make that move. Then they talked about all of the media leaks and reports that were coming out over the last couple of weeks as to what direction they do want to go in the first round of the draft. George Payton is going to kind of keep things a little bit more airtight than Sean Payton. I feel like sometimes Sean Payton will go a little bit on a verbal diarrhea tangent, and he'll spew a little bit too much information than what George wants to leak out. I wouldn't be surprised if George was kind of giving him the side eye a couple of times saying, Sean, you're not supposed to say that part out loud, Sean. George said, we don't know who we're going to take, so I don't know how anybody else knows. And that's a fair statement to at least put out publicly, but the Broncos have a pretty clear idea what direction they want to go. They have a pretty clear idea what direction that the board is going to fall. There can definitely be some surprises. You think about on draft night, the biggest draft night surprise I can think of the last few years was Daniel Jones being drafted 6th overall. Apparently, that move completely blindsided other teams, and there were some other moves as well that were made, like Johnny Manziel in the first round, that completely just blindsided draft boards and shook up the entire landscape of the NFL draft. Also, you think about the Texans last year coming up for Will Anderson after taking CJ Stroud at 2. Those are moves that are unprecedented, and you can't really predict those, but sometimes Sean Payton will scroll through Twitter, he says, and he'll see something he thinks could be interesting information, and then realize it was just some random fan, Timmy from Tucson, that he said, that tweeted that information. So sometimes there is information out there that swirls around in the media that's good, credible information that Sean draws interest to. And sometimes even us fans and amateur analysts such as myself, we can crank out some good information just based on pure speculation and reading between the lines. And I don't know, man. I'm curious to see if maybe Sean Payton saw one of my tweets and maybe I'm Timmy from Tucson. I don't know. That would be pretty hilarious, honestly. George Payton then said that I don't listen to as many podcasts as Sean, but it's good to have a pulse on the league, obviously. And when it's decision time, the only people that truly know who are going to make the decision are George and Sean. And I would obviously also throw in ownership into that, because I've said this before. Ownership is going to have to be the one who ultimately approves and gives the green light for whatever decision the Denver Broncos make, be it trade up, trade back, stay where they are, pass on quarterback, take a quarterback, whatever it's going to be. Ownership's going to approve it. So I think it's going to be George, Sean, and then obviously Greg and Kerry Pinner and other members of that group as well. Then we moved into changing the subject a little bit. We moved in to talk about the offseason program for the Denver Broncos, and some notable news over the last week is that Courtland Sutton did not show up for voluntary workouts. Sean said that 98% of the team has shown up, so only a couple players have not shown, and they have been in communication with those players, and that includes Courtland Sutton. Sean Payton says that they're in a good spot with Courtland right now, and that he firmly believes that Courtland will be back in the building at some point here in the near future. So, just like I said, Courtland doesn't have a whole lot of leverage in this situation. I talked about that in a previous video. I think that he's going to end up having to report, or else he's going to face some significant financial penalties. Then the Broncos were talking about their cornerback room a little bit. George Payton was asked how they feel about the cornerback spot, and he says that they're always looking to add to the room, but they feel confident about where the room is at. He says, we have one of the best corners in the league, assuming he's still going to be here, wink wink, and we like our nickel in Jaquan McMillan. We like our two young guys in Damari Mathis and Riley Moss. But you're always looking to add to that room. So I'm curious how confident the Broncos feel truly about Riley Moss, despite George Payton saying that they do view him as a starter in his January press conference. I do indeed wonder if the Broncos are indeed looking to add more to that room. They brought in Levi Wallace, veteran corner, for a workout a few days ago. That did not materialize into a signing, at least right now. I'm curious if they're at least just keeping Levi on standby in case they don't make a move for corner in the draft, maybe even if it's a little bit later on. If they don't, then wouldn't be surprised at all if they bring in somebody like a Levi Wallace to round out that room and increase the depth a little bit. Then the conversation came about trading away future first-round picks, and that's going to tie into this whole quarterback conversation with the news coming out that the Broncos are most likely going to have to compete with the Minnesota Vikings to get their guy. And Sean Payton had a really interesting answer here. He said, the fascinating thing about future first-round picks is you're dealing with an unknown value. The difference between pick number 4 and pick number 24 is big, and you don't know what that pick is going to be, obviously, 2 years from now. You could have a really good situation with your roster, and it could be a lower first-round pick, or you could have what happened in the Denver-Seattle trade for Russell Wilson, where Denver sent 2 really premium picks to Seattle because they ended up with bad records. That wasn't anticipated from the Broncos' perspective at all. So that is kind of the risk that you're gambling with when you're trading away future first-round picks. And it's the conversation that the Broncos are going to have if they make the decision to trade up and get a guy like J.J. McCarthy. Then an interesting question was asked by my guy Cecil Lammy. This is how the Broncos and George Payton and Sean Payton will settle a disagreement in the draft room if George wants to go in a certain direction and Sean wants to go in a certain direction. George said that the disagreements rarely get to draft day, but they kind of stared back and forth between each other a little bit, not really sure how to answer the question. George then revealed that he and Sean have a haircut wager on who gets drafted first at a certain position, and this kind of struck out to me a little bit. He then said, every now and then, Sean will say during the draft, I really want this player, let's go get him. So Sean is adamant when he wants to come up to get his guy, and if that guy is a quarterback, then I think Sean is going to get what he wants at the end of the day. And if they do have to outbid the Minnesota Vikings to get their guy, then Pat Surtain might be included in that deal. So that's the basics of what we got from the press conference today. Depending on how you want to interpret things, we either learned very little or we learned a ton. It just depends on how you interpret it. I think it's all about who you want to listen to at the end of the day. Do you give George Payton more credence in the fact that the Broncos may want to be a little bit more conservative? Or do you give Sean Payton more credence in the fact that he may want to be a little bit more aggressive? That's just the way that he's giving off, the vibe that he's giving off in this particular press conference. So I'm curious, Broncos country, who do you feel like is going to get their way at the end of the day? George Payton or Sean Payton? Drop those comments down below. I would love to hear your thoughts on that as always. And also let me know, would you be willing to part ways with Pat Surtain in a potential trade? Alright guys, be sure to leave a like on this video as well as subscribe and ring the bell so these videos appear in your notification feed. I would really appreciate it, guys. Those are two free and easy ways to show your support. It helps tell YouTube's algorithm to push us out and helps us get seen by more and more members of Broncos country just like you and me. We are just T-minus 7 days away from the NFL draft. Speculation season will finally be over, Broncos country, and I couldn't be more excited. Alright guys, peace out.